the amount of effort I put in the past over a weekend, a couple of hours, never finishing that system, and now in a weekend finishing a working prototype that was actually useful for me. That kind of tipped the scales.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 300. How to become an AI native engineer in 2025. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farson. Victor, happy 300th anniversary.
You sound like a married couple now, huh?
Well, you realize we've been doing this almost 6 years. It'll be 6 years in May, so we'll figure that out when we get there. But as we do on every Divide by 50 episode, we have Patrick Debois on with us. Patrick, how are you doing?
Great. I was just looking at how much gray hair everybody has after 6 years, but the listeners can't see it. But I was like, Victor, do you have gray hair as well?
Oh yeah, it's gray.
Yeah.
Now, what is actually surprising that all three of us have hair. That's the surprising part. Not that it's gray.
And I'm thankful for that. Patrick always fills us in on what's happening in his life over these past 50 weeks. So you just gave up on everything and went back to coding Visual Basic, right?
Yeah, it's my pleasure right now. Well, if you can, probably Python looks a little bit like Visual Basic right now. Yeah, that's all good.
How do we know that this is Patrick really? And he did not, since the last time we talked, actually convert himself into digital version or something.
Well, that's the beauty. You don't.
Obviously, we're nudging this way. Patrick has been all in on AI for this past year, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All in and AI are the same thing, right? AI, bad joke.
Okay.
I'll ask the question and then we'll go down the rabbit hole. I still see very little reason to use AI on a daily basis. I just don't see the use for it. I mean, okay, if I need to, write a title for this episode, or if I need to summarize the episode, great. Those are all wonderful things, but that's not a daily driver, right? That's a weekly edit for me. I just don't see a daily use. I'm not writing emails every day. I just don't know what it's for.
Can I ask something before Patrick answers, just to clarify? Do you mean visible AI or new AI? You use Google Maps often, right?
Yeah, but I don't consider that AI. That's just data. A lot of data, but it's just data. I know my A to B. I know what I'm doing. It's not something that's... I definitely don't want roads automatically generated for me, right? That don't exist. I don't understand the wow of people thinking that AI is all that and some chips. I just don't know. Am I just wrong, Patrick?
And this is where the episode ends. No. Well, I guess there's, I would say it's not that you can do the things that you're doing right now, but with certain tools and things, like you say, you can do certain jobs or parts of your job faster. And in your case, it might not be that obvious because you're doing summaries and maybe transcriptions or stuff like that this is kind of a limited part of your time. I think since last episode was more about on AI in the product, as you were saying. There's use cases, there are limited use cases, and things that are really in the sweet spot with, looking for content, going out and summarizing and all that stuff. So if that's something you live in a content management system, of course, this is going to help you more continuously. If this is only a touch point, that is limited. I think the journey that I've been transitioning into, which was something I might not like immediately expected, is I started coding again in a way that these tools help me to be more productive. And I know the whole discussion was about, well, use a Copilot. It's just a fancy tab completion. I think we're moving beyond that part, where I'm definitely seeing something that would have taken me weeks, or things that I've been postponing forever to be able to build. I always wanted to have a better system to keep track of my bookmarks. I don't know how many bookmarks I have, and researching and searching, and I never found like the perfect spot. With this new type of tooling, where it was not about me writing the code, but more about directing the specifications, how I want to have the system and how I want to have it coded, that like tipped the scale for me from, oh, well, it's a gimmick of coding, or, well, I feel like, I wouldn't say 10x, but I definitely feel like the improvement is vastly different. I've been able to build a very useful prototype, and I'm not saying this is production ready, but the amount of effort I put in the past over a weekend, a couple of hours, never finishing that system, and now in a weekend finishing a working prototype that was actually useful for me, that kind of tipped the scales. And so this gave me a boost on not just looking into, we're building it somewhere in the product, because that depends on your use case, whether it's like a specific thing. But for me, the coding thing actually completely multiplied what I was doing. So if you're a coder, if this is something you live in, if you're a prototyper, if you're a product manager who wants to express what they want, those tools are getting insanely kind of more productive. And I do want to say again, it is not the Copilot. It is systems like Cursor and beyond that actually start thinking more about requirements and doing stuff for us. So for me, that has been maybe the shift from me looking at AI since the last podcast, since what I'm kind of looking at right now. The term that, like, in the past, it would be the AI engineer. That was kind of the person building all the blocks of vector databases and LLMs and everything together. I think the term that is now kind of getting some traction there is kind of the AI native developer. And no, it's a pun on cloud native, and we don't know exactly what it's going to be. But there is a new kind of way of handling this stuff. And funnily enough, we're dealing more and more with managing requirements than with the code. So that kind of shift is something that I've seen over the last couple of months with tools coming out in that space. I don't know if you've seen some similar things on there.
So what you're saying is we can no longer run fast and break things? We actually have to plan?
No. What I'm saying is that it actually goes a lot faster to get feedback, because we don't have to wait for 2 months for somebody to have a go at this and do all the intricacies. For example, I didn't know exactly what I wanted with the bookmarking tool, but the fact that I could like wrap up and whip up these things says, oh, this is actually not what I needed. This is the next thing. No. So that kind of cycle was insanely sped up. And then I removed that whole thing and started doing this more from scratch. And there's a few things that I learned about doing with the tools. Like, one is the prototyping tool, but it's, if you're not very careful, it forgets things that you asked for. If you're doing it more systematically, you say, well, actually, I'm going to write tests. And if it touches my tests, I know it's changed somehow my spec or what I wanted. So that turned me into a different way of writing and doing the steps while I was coding. And funny enough, the writing tests all of a sudden became important again, which is something we've done and always looked at as a chore. But now it was more like, okay, what we always hoped for is that it was kind of gathering more of the specifications of what we wanted it to do. That's kind of been an observation for me in that kind of that space.
I hear conversations similar to what you just explained, but also what Darin started with. And I feel that the real problem with AI is in expectations, right? That it was so hyped that everybody expected the world to change completely for 180 degrees in a year or two, right? It somehow feels similar to self-driving cars, right? I have no doubt that that's coming. It did not come 3 years ago when Elon Musk said, yeah, we are 1 year away from it, right? That generates those expectations are, I mean, I understand why they're there because AI requires a lot of investment and you need to somehow pump everything up so that a lot of money comes into it. I understand that part. But I feel that that's the biggest problem that we're facing right now. Kind of dreams are being shattered because the dreams are wrong.
Yeah. And that's been a constant with whatever new wave, right? Oh, cloud's going to solve us, DevOps, serverless, and you name it. There's always kind of that touch. But what's different maybe here is that the amount of money that's been pumped into this at the shortest time, because everybody wants to be there, has been like insane on kind of that level. And it did create false expectations. And in that way, that is apparently a constant in our industry that we have a new technology, there's hype, it gets pumped up, people have different expectations, but it was the same thing with Agile, right?
The difference I feel is, I think you're right that we're having those waves of hypes all the time, but the cycles are getting shorter. 10 years ago, somebody would say, or 20 years ago, somebody would say, oh, this is a new thing, it will revolutionize everything in 10 years. And then 10 years ago, it was, oh, we're only 5 years away, right? And now we're only a year away from whatever is coming, right? So those cycles are getting shorter and shorter, or at least expectations.
But as an engineer, I would say, yes, we obviously have the annoyance that whoever is kind of telling what to build, they believe the dream and, we have to make it. And it's not always that possible or kind of what the product needs. But on the other hand, I don't want to dismiss the things that it does. And I think that's the other thing that is typical about this phase, even though it's shorter and more peaked, is finding out what works and what doesn't work and what kind of like new ways of working. That's what makes this period so quite interesting. But it is a chaos period in a way that we don't know exactly like where we're going to land. It's like the lift and shift to the cloud where we said, well, we're just doing VLANs as we used to do. We're running like machines as we used to do. So that transition is, even on the coding, everybody still was, oh, we're just going to code as we used to code. And now you see the first hints of, oh, well, maybe a few people have tried like something different. So there's a hint. Will this be more cost effective? I'm not advocating this without caution because in a way that, imagine we're doing more code generation by the tools. We're not writing the code. There is the problem, obviously, to understand whether the code is good and that the code is doing what it says it does. So, but that's almost like shifting complexity. So we have a new way. It brings a new set of problems. So are we going to like build tooling to overcome kind of that other side? That's understanding the limitations, and maybe we'll find a mitigation. Maybe we'll be turning into kind of reviewers, and the developers all become ops persons because they're babysitting the agents writing the code. I don't know what it is, but there's certainly like something of a shift going on that whatever people believe, and in this case it is, oh, it is going to improve. So on every board, there is the question, what are we doing? What's our AI strategy? And so we're doing it to ourselves to respond to that in, oh, well, maybe we could do this. It is fascinating to see that interaction between, kind of the hype on certain levels that influences how people think about what we should do, and then we'll have to cope with it. It is maybe not something that I'm too busy of, but I just assume that people are going to demand on this. So I'll better have an answer. That's kind of my opinion. So the best way to get an answer is to kind of like get into the weeds and see what people are doing and how they're coping with this, and maybe distill some strategy to deal with this. I could say no, and then I'll probably the old person with the gray hair, as we all are, that says no to new technology, which I don't want to be in that phase, right?
So if I would have a lot of money to give you to invest in AI, which areas do you think would, excluding coding now, right? Because to me that's almost clear win, right? Which areas do you feel would be the first impacted in general, outside of writing code?
I'm mostly talking here about generative AI and not kind of AI in general. But my bet would somewhere be in maybe future entertainment. And it sounds strange, but it's like typically one of those domains that picks up new technology in a new way that makes it more commercial. Whether that was, a PDF to promote certain types of books or something, they're quite early, and their industry is also impacted as well. I would eventually think that leads into certain more creative ways of doing things in entertainment, which has been also a search for many years and a promise about, VR is going to be the differentiator, or kind of like live streaming, or so that's another search. But if I see the storytelling and the ease and what people can do with this visually, and so I would say the effort of, if you know your content, and I'm not saying everybody can make great content, but that kind of production budget goes so much down in a way that it's becoming democratized. And it's already a little bit like kind of recording here a podcast or something has been going on, but I would expect that kind of to continue maybe on kind of media production sides as well. So, and game creation or things like that. But again, that's speculation all.
If I stick with the example of media, it probably applies. Do you think that it will be mostly democratized or something reserved for Netflix type of budget? Are we moving towards, hey, anybody with a good idea can use this thing and generate high quality something?
Maybe I can make the comparison between, in the past, you would have to have a newspaper as a portal to other things. Now we have the internet, you can put up your own site. You would have to have a television budget or kind of stream that kind of got into, hey, I'm having a YouTube channel like a Mr. Beast or something that had like similar thing, but in a new kind of entertainment thing. Then the crossover will work because they want the social media to come in the mainstream media, and that's happening. But they're doing this like insanely shows on a shoestring budget compared to a TV budget. But they do get the viewers. So that's kind of what impacted them. But yeah, it's speculation in that term. Learning is another one that it might be, but I'm not sure. Educational, and the reason why I say that is because we would love everything to be high quality content on education, but we're not always willing to pay for this that much anymore. So it is tricky. In the multitude of information and whatever on the internet, curation, funny enough, becomes more important. So that style of, hey, I'll navigate you to the storm. This is what you should know. Kind of that compass. But that's in general. Like, would that have been without AI? But I think the continuous thing on even more content gets created, and your joke, like, is this really Patrick? Like, is this trustworthy? So that kind of will give certain things a new spin in that perspective. Now we're sounding also depressive. So.
Well, you're taking me back to the beginning of what's it good for? I mean, okay, if it's entertainment, again, that was a variation of me editing the podcast. It's just helping that part of things. I think to Victor's point, I don't think it's going to be democratized unless you have Daddy's trust fund to pay for everything. Because I don't know how you bring down the cost to make it democratized in the near term? Near term meaning 10, 20 years.
Just to clarify, I was going in the opposite direction. I was rooting for being
Well, I know you were.
democratized.
I just don't think it can be. Again, this may be old guy yelling at sky.
Let's say that you create an animation cartoon, right? Pixar quality cartoon with AI in the future, let's say a few years from now, right? It would be very highly unlikely that that would be just as expensive as what Pixar was spending so far. Right? With, I don't know, 1,000 people working on a single short movie, cartoon. I'm more interested kind of what I feel is happening, and I like the example of entertainment that Patrick was talking about, right? YouTubers, what's not on a shoestring budget. I'm interested to see whether it will be something like that, which is a story of it leveled the playing field. And now the playing field is not leveled anymore, right? Now you need to have Mr. Beast's budget to succeed on YouTube, right? But Mr. Beast could start with no budget. Right? It took a while until people figured out how to pour money into it, in a way. I don't mean it as investment, but rather as users.
You would say this, that move to on-prem after so many years of cloud that like it was like very early democratized and now it's like expensive and getting more expensive. You're rethinking like, well.
That's actually a good analogy, right? Because I remember like 5 years ago or something like that, maybe 10, cloud enabled anybody to start online business with almost no budget. Now you cannot do that anymore. I guess that's because through all those advancements, the expectations changed, right? You cannot have a successful business anymore by having a single VM in AWS. And you could. It sounds unimaginable today, but you could. You needed a server. But now you need a server farm. Historically, I feel that all those changes were going in that direction. It enabled everybody. And over time, the situation changed.
Let me ask this question. Let's go down a different route, because if we start talking about on-prem, this is going to get dark really fast. Which, of course, that's my favorite place to be. There's nothing like a deep, dark data center 3 stories underground.
And locked from the other side so that you stay there.
Exactly, yes. Models. Let's talk models right now. Because I've been a very happy user of Ollama in general, like testing out, not having to spend any money. I mean, that's good, right? But the quality that I get out of it, because I'm having to run smaller models, like I can run Llama 3 to 3 billion, no problem, on my Mac Studio. That's just easy. But if I try to load up the latest Llama 3.3 that came out, that's a 70 billion, it just doesn't run. It just doesn't run on the Mac Studio, which is understandable, right? And I'm okay with that. I was just like, okay, there's the trade-offs. It's still amazing to me that you can get even an SLM, small language model, to run on a phone, and it actually does reasonable work. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me. But when I switch over and it's like, okay, now I just go use OpenAI for certain things. I've got a use case that I do each week, once a week. And I've been using OpenAI, just GPT-4, whatever the latest GPT-4 is. I just keep that updated. And then I bake it against Llama 3.2. And it's night and day what I get out of the two, pumping the exact same prompt into each of those. And in this case, OpenAI wins. How do we make the decision as we're going forward? Are we just writing a ton of tests and just swapping models out to see what potential answer we get back that is right or wrong in our eyes?
I would say that what you're saying is two different things. Like one is over the beginning of GPT-3, 3.5, there was no open source on par. Now there's a few of them. One notably is like Mixtral from the company Mistral, which if you compare and you run it on a beefy enough machine, you're able to run this and get similar quality. So that's one thing. So yes, you'll need more hardware, but it is able to replicate some of the quality. That's a good thing, that at least if you have the money for your own thing, you can do it. The second part is, obviously, if you want to switch models, as they are trained in auto completion, one of the big problems I've seen in companies switching to models is that they have to rewrite all the prompts of their coding and work from there. We have solutions in a way that the first one that most of the people do is you write a bunch of tests. It is not just about writing tests like I have a prompt and I'm expecting this output or the word in the output or something like that. This also hits your harness when you switch, much like your TDD, when you switch like a backend. Hey, I'm kind of switching here. But it is quite an iterative process in a way that it's not whack-a-mole, but I'm rewriting the prompt, so more of my cases go green. Now, the strange thing is, compared to traditional testing, is that it might not all go green, and you'll have to figure out what is the most important thing, what am I kind of opting out, or maybe that's good enough as a result. So that's been the strategy of people coping it in a way that they have a safety net, which is evaluations, that it's called. And they have your test battery you run when you switch the model, and you see whether it's kind of like up to the same level. Now, a third solution that is emerging is that we're taking the prompt of one LLM that works well, and we have almost like a rewriter of the prompts, like an abstraction layer. It's not exactly that, but in a way that it translates prompt calls for one into a prompt call for another. So it's like a translator. And that's been an interesting field in a way that you're rewriting the prompts. Now, if you have that prompt rewriting and you have your test harness, there is a certain level of automation that you can say, well, kind of continue, and kind of like, it's not a human, but you can get it up to a level that it is actually automated rewiring the prompt. Now, if there are specific tasks that you're demanding, you might want to train specific models with the stuff that you're doing. So that might be a better way for you to get results than rewriting the prompts. And that's kind of like, this is kind of a layout of different strategies that people have been doing to switching from one LLM kind of to the other. But you can't all of a sudden have the same results on, shoestring budget MacBook that something in the cloud has. I often make the comparison between, because I know a lot of devs ask, I want my local setup. It's nice. I can code with it. And I always tell them, we had that kind of conversation. So to run your tests, are you running them in the cloud, or are you running them in containers on your laptop? And you have certain limitations that you can't do. But the difference is, with the containers, often the functionality is the same, but maybe the size of the CPU is not different, and so on. So we worked hard on that kind of portability on something small to something big. And you see the efforts happening now also in kind of the prompt and the LLM world to deal with those kind of strategies.
How do those tests look like? While you were talking about those tests, I was thinking, hey, heck, many of us still did not figure out how to effectively test web pages. And they're flaky and they don't work more often than not, and so on and so forth. And the only reliable tests that I'm seeing in a while are unit tests based on the code directly. When it comes to something graphical, it fails. Now, I know that graphical is not what you're talking about, but I imagine that being even more challenging, because the issue with web pages is that they're not exactly the same always. There is a certain level of variability. And with AI, that must be multiplied by infinity, right?
Yes. Well, much as you say in testing, we can't run a test with a for loop of 1 to infinity, because that does not make sense, and we can't run that test. So we kind of take samples and things that make sense. To give you an idea on the testing, there's a few different types. One is, I would call, hey, GPT, give me where Victor lives, right? And I expect to have it the right answer. But instead of it telling, let's say it's in London. I don't know where actually you live, but let's say it's in London. you don't want it to say it is in London because then I can't test it. So we'll give it a few synthetic sugar, only answer with one word, do it in English, blah, blah, blah. And you kind of get that one word, something you can easily test with a string comparison. The next thing you could do is tell me all you know about Victor, and I wanted to hit certain keywords. So it's a little bit more elaborate. It's still string. Let's think about it as a regex. Maybe there's like some pluralization. You can think about that, kind of finding keywords in that.
So
stuff.
Looking for keywords in the output in a way. Okay.
Yeah. So that's kind of the second way. The third way is a sneaky one, because let's say, please generate me this test, and I want it to be joyful. I can't think about the better example, but the fact that it's joyful or not, I can actually use a helper model, not an LLM, but a model that's been trained and saying, given this text, this is the output, it's joyful, it's angry, I don't know what it is. So you use kind of a helper model for a certain property that you want to test it. You can combine it without any of the previous things, but that's kind of like a helpful thing. The third way that people are doing testing is, training those kind of special models. Let's say, is this output looking like Victor? Well, I don't know. So it's kind of like not like I have to train it in the model, and it's quite like intensive. So what people are doing is the fourth type of testing is called LLM as a judge. So you ask another LLM to judge the output of the first LLM, which sounds crazy, but on the other hand, like this is not that bad a strategy, because what you're looking at is it's a different thing. Maybe you use a reasoning model to reason why it's good and bad compared to something that generates the model. This sounds cheap, but it is actually quite complex. But you see, before you're doing kind of the training of specific models, you want to go a little bit more that route. And much like you do TDD, the TDD is I can write my unit tests and so on. But initially, TDD was about making your stuff testable, right? So you understand what is important, what is not important. So the LLM as a judge actually helps you to specify, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for that. So that kind of iterative almost process of developing LLM as a judge testing helps you actually to understand, actually that wasn't that important. and I'm looking for these things. So there is an iterative process of people looking at that stuff. And then maybe to finish off, the fifth type of testing is it's giving me an answer, and it's not about correct or not correct, but is this similar to some other output of text? So it's more like a vector database works, is A similar to B? So that's kind of like as a contextual or kind of a thing that works. So those are, like, as far as I know, the types of testing. But much like you were saying with the web kind of testing, it is brittle, and some might work all the time. Some are flaky tests. Some are changing with the model if you're testing it. So it's costly, but again, this is shifting the complexity of something simple to, hang on, now we have the complexity on our tests to build this in. Now, the final way of testing, as we all know, is in production. What do you do there is you can use the same techniques. And I always give the example, let's say you've written some API testing, right? And you run your unit tests and that's all good. If you have that kind of monitoring setup that is doing probing on kind of that API and looking at the error messages, that is another thing that you need to have as a safety net. So it's not about just having your test, because as you mentioned, the end user has an endless set of possibilities that it can enter. So now I have observability tools that look at security, keywords, and all that stuff. So the kind of similar techniques are used. Some of the monitoring are using LLM as a judge. But guess what? The cost goes up because every call now is tested with another call. So everything's multiplied by 1 for one specific quality thing. So one production end user call might now result in 10 LLM calls for monitoring. So kind of that shifting But as long as the cost goes down, we are able to mitigate these things. But it shows you a way of how things shift in, we're making it easier here. So now all of a sudden it becomes like a little bit harder there. But it is known techniques, observability testing, but it is kind of in with some new tooling, I would say.
Because I imagine that it must be getting worse over time. Because I remember in early days when I used Copilot or whatever I use for coding, sometimes I would ask for a Go code and I get Python code and kind of like, okay, man, this is obviously wrong. But over time, it's harder and harder to figure out whether the output you're getting is wrong or no, because it still equally doesn't work, but it looks so good. Kind of like, sometimes I feel that it takes me more time to figure out. I'm talking about code, but I guess that could be extrapolated to anything else, to figure out whether it's wrong.
And that's the shift you're seeing is you go from a producer of the code to the reviewer of the code. So that's the pattern. We've seen this in other automation tools as well. The more you automate, the more you become the supervisor. In your CI/CD, you're the one that kind of deals with the failures. Like you hope that like it all goes well. And so you still have to be good at this. So all the time we're going to save with this. I always say, like, if you look at the progression of, the DevOps space, first was, let's have some tests in our CI. Then they said, let's have CI/CD. So that's good. That was relatively the easy part. Then we learned, hang on, it can fail. We need monitoring. We need observability. Okay. But why don't we architect for this? So let's have resilience engineering as a craft to deal with the fact that we're failing. And then as much as we know all the failure and try to predict all the failure, we're trying to do something like a chaos engineering to make sure that we're continuously probed to know when things are failing and deal with failure, because we're not good at dealing with failure anymore. But when it does, you want to be prepared. So it's like the firemen who have to prepare for the fire, but it might not happen all the time. Similar to here, like you're doing the code, but when it fails, you want to be prepared and understand what it does. Now, what can the machines do for us in this case? And the answer that I found is always like, when there's a problem with AI, you use more AI, right? So that's kind of like, that's like, you want to test the LLM, use another LLM. So just
it's the same way how companies were solving problems so far, but with people. Yeah. You cannot meet the deadline, hire 50 more.
Yeah, indeed. What was interesting is if you look at the coding tools, and this is maybe not about like judging whether it's good and bad, but we've already have a few tools at our disposal. We have like some linters, maybe some security checkers. So all those tools is helping us in part of that review. It's not that we're kind of, completely blind, as these tools also will get better. Now, the example I often give is, if you give me a pull request with 500 lines, that's going to be hard for me to review what the impact is, or like multiple files edited. Now, one of the trends you're seeing in kind of the code editors is that they figured out that it is actually important, the developer cognitive load while reviewing. So they break that big review up into steps. This file has changed because of that. So it's not just giving you the kind of green, red div. It is helping you guide through the changes. So it becomes like almost like a guided task that is saying, how do you think about that? What is this? This is caused by that. So it's even collapsing the code in a way. Let's say you have a function. It's abstracting the function away and it's just replacing this with a comment. The function is doing this. That's it. So I don't need to read the whole code. I can just read it in text. So those kind of dealing with cognitive load, and whether that's while coding or that's going to be dealing with production issues, is going to be something that will continuously see improving. A great example of this, and I don't know if you've heard of Devin, it was kind of one of those tools that was the autonomous coder one of the first things they kind of added while the autonomous things will happen is that you have checkpoints and things you can roll back to. So you see, similar to I change a VM or I change a container, I have an easy way to go back. So all that safety net is, in my opinion, we're now more and more we'll see happening. Similar to CI/CD was the code generation. It's relatively easy. Okay, there's quite a lot of things we could do. But now we're moving on to when it fails, what do we do? And that's kind of brings it back to ops. And so brings it back to a whole new fun story. Another thing that people have been doing, I don't know if you're familiar with the folks from Code Scene. They look at when code is changing in a way that it looks at the complexity of the human to understand the code. So it's not just about cranking out code that is useful. They do look at kind of these things as well. Anyway, again, it's all tools to shift complexity and deal with that complexity. Is it better than what we do? But, that's kind of the progressive insights in this that we're trying to figure out. And it would only be similar to, let's say, we went to serverless. Was it all better? But it seems like we always have to go a little bit too far to understand what the limitations are and then say, well, this was serverless, this is containers, this is what you should do. And that's what we're figuring out as an industry.
Where do you think we're at in the hype cycle right now? Are we still on the way up? Have we headed towards the trough? Are we gone past the trough yet?
I think we're still going up. What I do see is that people have the similar feeling that you said, Darren, about, it's not giving us the value. But when I look up the different technologies and the people that are trying to mitigate this, when those things are getting in place, then there's going to be almost like a new jump at what it is useful. So a lot of people dismiss AI on the first sight of what it can do right now. And it's not because I'm super specialized in kind of LLMs and so on, but I do see a lot of kind of small things heading towards improvement that will take some of that initial pain away. Asking something, my wife says like, I'm using ChatGPT. It did give me the answers. AI is bad, right? Give it some time. And that's the time it wasn't given because of the fast hype. But in my opinion, it's still going upwards in the hype cycle there.
Could it be that the scopes are too wide? It feels like as if many of us are, not us, not me included though, are trying to solve with AI everything. And I feel that it would be much more useful to solve specific problems. Like, hey, how can we make moving packages in a warehouse more efficient? Like, kind of like very specific. It feels like, if I extrapolate to before AI, what we were doing with development and stuff like that, the moment you figure out how to focus on a certain thing, that thing starts moving, right?
I would say it is moving in that way. People always ask like, okay, what's the biggest thing that AI kind of had an impact? And I always answer back like, it's going to be somewhere, everywhere, like a 0.5%. But if you combine that, it's going to be different. So I'm not looking for the big bang or the kind of the change there. It is, well, if all of a sudden LLMs get a little bit cheaper and the code generations get a little bit better and this gets a little bit better, then all of a sudden I feel like there's like a clicking happening. If I see the number of prototypes that people are building with a tool like Lovable or something, that creates like almost like a new space of people trying and seeing what they can do. The far-fetched of the end is, how's it called again? You have software as a service, and some people are saying service as a software. The whole discussion was about, why am I even buying software if I can generate everything when it gets so good? Because I don't need all the 100 features of that thing, but if I can do it myself. So maybe that like tips the way we think about the industry, that it becomes part of it as a 3D printer for software. But for other things, we'd still kind of buy the whole product. But for some things, it's going to be things that we can print ourselves. I don't know if that is where we're heading, but it's an interesting kind of way of looking at like the extreme, maybe.
Yeah, the printer analogy is quite interesting because, just like you said earlier, things aren't production ready. And if people do a print and they're not aware of what it really is, they may think it's production ready, but in reality, it probably isn't. Unless going back to what Victor said, unless it's really tightly scoped. This thing is going to do this one thing. But let's get real. How many pieces of software do just a single thing other than Unix command lines? And even that can be argued that those don't do single things. You talked about the judging thing. That's agentic type stuff. Do you think that's really going to take off, or is that going to become the normal way of doing things, or is it still the one-off that we're doing today?
I almost see it as regardless of the cost, because that's the other discussion about this. We had an LLM, then we learned, LLMs on its own, when we mix it a little bit with RAG, that giving us better results. If we mix it a little bit with structured output, it's giving us even better results. And I feel agents will, again, improve part of that result. We might have to deal with a longer latency, which is okay for some cases, which is not okay for certain cases. So we're having to balance, almost like we had to balance memory and CPU. It's going to be like how many agents and how good the quality and is it acceptable. But it will kind of improve the results on what we're doing. I do have an anecdote on, like an example I always had was generate me a bash script to list the files in the current directory. And the LLMs, in the past it was kind of, but it's a simple thing, just a bash ls, right? It's not like that hard. When I set up agents, I gave one agent the identity of a dev, one of the ops, and one of security. And I told them, hey, take sides or kind of take turns on creating this script. And you start like seeing this script becoming, there's this edge case and there's this security case, and we should check that it's root. And it's going it's easy to go out of bounds where it goes. Now, the next experiment I did was, instead of just saying, here's the code, what do you think, improve this, improve this, improve that. I used a tool called LangGraph, which is more like guiding agents into a workflow. Well, there's only a limited set of states you can go into this workflow. It's not about like you creating an image or something. No, you can just improve, review code. So you give it specific tasks in the workflow you can do. And then the agents perform way better to do this. Now, this is a simple example, but the fact that you can have those multiple perspectives in many cases do improve the result. But if it's let too loose, then it can go into, today it worked brilliantly. Tomorrow it's going somewhere and trying to send you an email to ask Victor, please can you kind of write that bash script for me? So kind of that limitations is what people are starting to find out in the agents, had to constrain them to certain cases and work from there.
So 50 weeks from now, where are we standing with AI? Are we still in the same place? Have we leaped forward?
I can't predict, because maybe tomorrow there's a new model that is insanely more productive. And as Sam Altman said a couple of days ago, we're reaching AGI. Anyway, I'm not nowhere near. I do see kind of the tools evolving in a way that I kind of see it more being used. There's also more of the annoyances being solved. So that's just going to continue at the similar pace that we're doing right now, in my opinion.
Are the salaries for AI native engineers going to go to 7 figures?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think, maybe they will, but maybe they won't find enough people with the kind of new skills. So there is always kind of that uptick of the scarcity with a new skill, and that kind of becomes commodity over time. So, but 6-7 figures, I don't think so.
What are the skills that we do need to be learning right now if we want to hit that high 6 number? I mean, in a lot of places, high 6 is just normal, but it's not where I live. Is there anything we can do? If we had Daddy's trust fund to fund us so we can test everything on our own, then we could probably learn some things. But if we're somebody coming fresh out of school, or somebody like me that's getting towards the back end of the career, what can we do?
I like the saying that says, don't build a tool, but build a tool that builds the tool. So you need to be thinking more at like, how do you delegate part of the things that you're doing? So that's one way that you start rethinking the things you do. Now, you might not be able to trust the AI right now to do the best job, but think about it as an intern that you're reviewing. So kind of that mentality is helpful. Now, the second one is, again, it's a gut feeling. You might be less of a code generator, but we'll have to start like be more attentive to business kind of requirements and having those discussions in there. So that would be an evolution for people only doing the tech to going also part of the business, because it's not that it's like a complete commodity, but to have those tools shine, it will probably help to specify better, not just the tech requirements, but to kind of help with the business requirements and get from there. So that's a skill, but that's kind of a skill you would also be useful without AI to kind of get a business understanding, because then you get a better understanding what you're building and whether you're building the right thing versus the thing right. That's kind of that discussion. And for the rest, I can always say, like, experiment with the tools. And I know that's daunting, but what I would see in the tools is that they are AI tools, they're all data hungry. And if you now have a specific style for coding, think about how you can externalize and describe that type of the things that you find important to your coding as more of a requirements document. So how that is helpful, if let's say that information is already helpful if there's an onboarding for new kind of people coming in. Same thing with tests, writing tests, because as I mentioned in the beginning, documentation and tests and understanding what it needs to be done, it's all context. So the more you spend time on improving the context and removing maybe duplicate requirements, conflicting requirements, or kind of managing on that, that will also make the AI tool shine more while we're progressing. So that could be another area of view, like look for more context and then kind of try to make this more in reusable context. People magically dream that their wiki will be cleaned up or kind of that their tests will be written. But the problem usually is you get a spike on documentation, you get a spike on testing, and then it kind of like goes over. Now, with some of the AI tooling, we can keep more of a monitoring and a view on, is the documentation still up to date? So think of it as also automating those parts of getting better context, not like you having to do this all the time to go in there. Anyway, I don't feel that all sounds like advice, but it's like different threads in my head, I guess.
It sounds like we need to either become an engineering manager or the VP of a branch of a company, that kind of thinking, and start building out our own little teams that are just models that we have tightly tuned. And then we can just hand over our job to them again and focus on the tests and the requirements. If we get those two right, then everything else could be, quote unquote, automated.
But again, everybody, yes, dealing with the exceptions and the errors and understanding when it fails, that's still a thing, right? So
I do want to go back as we're finishing up. You brought up Devon earlier. I saw a tweet earlier this week about a company was using Devon and it did something wrong. And of course, they didn't review it, and it cost them an extra $700 plus the $500 that it cost to actually run Devon. So because they didn't take the time to review what pull request Devon put in, it cost them $1,200. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the warning, is just because you have something right, it doesn't mean that humans shouldn't review it.
Blind automation is not good that way. But we had the same stories with DevOps. Oh, automate and the whole system goes down.
You can just replace word person instead of AI, that what you just said, Darin, and get the same story.
Yeah.
Developer or junior developer just pushed some changes to the repo that was deployed to production. Nobody reviewed it. It was a disaster. Yes.
But I think the point is that you, like, the thing that I want to get across is this is technology that's generative and non-deterministic. So the trust levels should always stay low. The problem is with the kind of thing with automation is if it goes well 9 times, we expect this to be okay the 10th time. That's what we've always thought. But if you take the analogy of your CI/CD pipeline, it's not because 9 commits went well that the 10th will be same thing. But for that, we have either reviews, peer reviews, which in this case is useful. And like I mentioned, on reducing the cognitive load of reviewing and kind of helping with that as well. And then your test suite, right? Your specifications that you can test against it. They're becoming more important than before. In a way, like if we always said, like, if you want to go faster, you need better brakes. And we've already did this with our CI/CD, but now if we take that next leap, what are going to be our brakes, right? So that's what we need to be thinking about.
I think the one takeaway I'm going to take away from this today is I need to learn all of my Markdown syntax like the back of my hand. Because if I know Markdown, then that's going to simplify everything.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. Well, anyway, Patrick, thanks for being with us again on 300. You'll be back. I don't have the date in front of me, but it'll be about mid-January of 2026. Holy cow. That's the year I turned 60.
We'll have candles next time.
Well, I won't be that old then, but I'll be on the
which
approach.
candles?
All 60 of them?
There is a birthday candle and there is a church candle. I just wanted to make sure to understand.
Birthday candle. Birthday candle.
Birthday. Okay.
I'm
cool,
going to be
cool,
here.
cool.
Right. Thanks, Patrick.
You're welcome.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.